The Mediterranean sun blazed overhead as 10 German Bf-109 fighters descended like hawks upon a lone British bomber struggling back to base. Inside the rear turret, Susan Wanjiru gripped her twin Browning machine guns, her knuckles tight against the cold metal. The radio crackled with her pilot's desperate voice. "We're not going to make it." But Susan had other plans. If you love untold stories of extraordinary courage from World War II, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button. You won't want to miss what happens next. What happened in the next 2 minutes and 14 seconds would defy every tactical manual, shock military historians, and cement Susan Wanjiru's name in aviation legend. This is the story of how a young woman from the highlands of Kenya, armed with nothing but nerve, instinct, and 2 machine guns, accomplished what veteran gunners said was impossible. This is the story of the day the sky rained fire, and one woman stood alone against the Luftwaffe's best. The year was 1943, and the Mediterranean theater was a killing field in the sky. Allied bomber crews faced a 60% casualty rate. 6 out of every 10 men who climbed into those aircraft never came home. The Axis powers controlled the air with ruthless efficiency, and their Bf-109 fighters were the apex predators of this aerial battlefield. Susan Wanjiru shouldn't have been there at all. Women weren't officially allowed in air combat roles, and colonial subjects from British East Africa were rarely given opportunities beyond support positions. Yet through a combination of determination, exceptional skill, and wartime desperation, she found herself manning the rear gun turret of a Vickers Wellington bomber, one of the most exposed, dangerous positions in military aviation. The rear gunner was the bomber's last line of defense, sitting alone in a cramped perspex bubble at the tail of the aircraft. They faced backward, watching for enemy fighters while the rest of the crew focused forward. It was cold, isolated, and terrifying. The average life expectancy of a rear gunner was just 5 missions. Susan had already completed 12. Born in 1921 in the Kikuyu Highlands outside Nairobi, Susan grew up hunting with her brothers, developing an uncanny ability to track fast-moving targets through dense brush. When war broke out, she volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, initially assigned to meteorology. But during a training accident, when a gunner was injured, she demonstrated such natural aptitude with the weapons that her commanding officer took the unprecedented step of recommending her for combat training. Now, on this scorching afternoon in May 1943, all that training, all that natural instinct, would be tested in the most intense aerial combat engagement of her life. Her bomber had been damaged during a raid on Axis shipping, one engine smoking, barely maintaining altitude. They were alone, separated from their formation, limping across 200 miles of enemy-controlled Mediterranean. And then the Bf-109s found them. Susan first spotted them as tiny specks against the brilliant blue sky, glinting in the sunlight like distant stars. But stars didn't move like that, darting, weaving, closing the distance with predatory intent. She keyed her intercom immediately. "Skipper, we've got company. 10 o'clock high, Angels 15. Multiple bandits inbound." Squadron leader Peter Michaels, the pilot, checked his instruments. The starboard engine was overheating badly, trailing a plume of dark smoke that made them visible for miles. The Wellington was managing barely 180 miles per hour, wounded prey in an ocean of sky. "Can you count them, Susan?" She counted carefully, her heart beginning to pound. 10, sir. All Bf-109s by the look of them. There was a long pause on the intercom. 10 fighters against a crippled bomber with 1 operational gunner. The front gun position had been destroyed during the raid. The mathematics of aerial combat were brutally simple, and these numbers added up to death. "Right then," Michaels finally said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "We're 40 minutes from the coast. I'll try to keep her level and give you the best firing platform I can. The rest is up to you." Susan settled deeper into her gunner's seat, adjusting the Browning guns, checking the ammunition feeds. Each gun had 2,500 rounds, enough for about 30 seconds of continuous fire. She'd learned in training to fire in short, precise bursts. Ammunition was life, and you didn't waste life. The Bf-109s were splitting into attack formation now, spreading wide to come at the Wellington from multiple angles. It was classic fighter tactics. Divide the gunner's attention, force her to choose which threat to engage, then exploit the openings. She'd seen it happen before, watched other bombers torn apart by coordinated attacks. But Susan had grown up hunting Cape buffalo with her brothers in the Aberdare Highlands. Buffalo were dangerous, cunning animals that would double back on hunters, using terrain and surprise to turn hunted into hunter. She'd learned patience from her father. Wait for the right moment, don't panic, trust your instincts. And she'd learned from her mother something equally important. When the moment comes, act without hesitation or mercy. The lead BF-109 was coming in now, a shallow dive from 5 o'clock high. Susan could see the pilot clearly, leather helmet, oxygen mask, the insignia on the aircraft's fuselage. He was good, approaching from the sun's angle to blind her. But Susan had already looked away, tracking him by sound and peripheral vision, letting her eyes adjust. The fighter opened fire at 400 yards. Too far for accurate shooting, but intimidation was part of the game. Tracer rounds arced past the Wellington like angry hornets. Susan didn't flinch. She waited, hands steady on the gun controls, watching the range close. 300 yards. 250. 200. Now. Her thumbs pressed the firing buttons, and the twin Brownings roared to life, the noise deafening even through her leather helmet. She fired a 3-second burst, leading the target just enough to account for the fighter's speed and angle. Brass casings erupted from the guns, tumbling away in the slipstream. The BF-109 shuddered as rounds struck home. She saw pieces of the engine cowling fly off, then smoke, black, thick smoke. The fighter peeled away sharply, trailing fire, beginning the long death spiral toward the sea below. 1 down, she reported calmly, already tracking the next threat. But 9 remained, and they weren't intimidated anymore. They were angry. The BF-109s abandoned their careful approach patterns and came in together, for from the starboard side, 3 from port, 2 staying high as a reserve. It was a hammer-blow attack, designed to overwhelm through sheer volume of fire. Susan had maybe 8 seconds before they were all in range. This was the moment where most gunners died, frozen by the impossible choice of targets, trying to engage everything at once and hitting nothing. But Susan's mind worked differently. Growing up, she'd hunted with her brothers in the way of her people, not as separate individuals, but as a coordinated group, each person understanding their role instinctively. She couldn't be everywhere at once, but she could create chaos that felt like she was. She chose the starboard group first because they were marginally closer. Leading with 3 rapid bursts, 2 seconds each, she walked her fire across the approaching formation. The key wasn't to destroy them all immediately. It was to disrupt their attack pattern, force them to break formation and evade. The first fighter in the starboard group took hits across the wing root and broke left sharply. The second, seeing his wingman's predicament, also broke, disrupting his firing solution. But the third and fourth kept coming, their cannon fire tearing chunks from the Wellington's tail section. Susan felt the aircraft shudder with each impact, heard metal screaming. She switched targets to the port group, firing ahead of the lead fighter in a technique called hosing, laying down a curtain of bullets that the enemy had to fly through. The lead 109 tried to slip under her fire, but that's exactly what she anticipated. She dropped her aim a fraction and was rewarded with the sight of her tracers chewing into the fighter's cockpit. The BF-109 snapped into a violent barrel roll and didn't pull out, tumbling toward the water. 2 down. The Wellington lurched suddenly as Michaels threw the bomber into a desperate bank, trying to spoil the aim of the remaining attackers. Susan was slammed against the side of her turret, momentarily disoriented. When she recovered, 3 fighters were racing past at knife fighting range. So close she could see the pilots' faces, expressions frozen in concentration. But close range worked both ways. She hammered all 3 as they passed, her guns screaming, the smell of cordite overwhelming inside the turret. One fighter took fire in the left wing fuel tank and exploded instantly, a ball of orange flame that mushroomed and fell. Another staggered, trailing coolant, its engine dying. The pilot would probably make it back to base, but he was out of this fight. 3.5 down. The remaining fighters broke off momentarily, regrouping about 1,000 yards out. Susan used the breathing space to check her ammunition. She'd burned through nearly a quarter of her supply. At this rate, she'd be empty in less than 2 minutes. And she still had 6.5 fighters to deal with. "Susan, you're doing brilliantly," Michaels called over the intercom. "But I don't know how much more damage this old girl can take. We've got holes in both wings, and the hydraulics are failing." "Just keep us in the air, sir," she replied, her voice eerily calm. "They're getting cautious now. They know we bite back." But caution only lasted so long. The Luftwaffe pilots out there were professionals, decorated veterans who'd seen dozens of bombers fall. They were regrouping, planning a better approach. Susan could almost read their tactical discussion in the way they positioned themselves. They'd learned she was deadly and close, but limited in ammunition. They'd wear her down, death by 1,000 cuts. The next attack came from directly astern, 3 fighters in a vertical stack, high, middle, and low. It was clever. She couldn't engage all 3 simultaneously, and whichever one she ignored would have a free shot at the Wellington's already damaged tail section. Susan made a snap decision that would later be analyzed in tactical training schools. Instead of trying to stop all 3 attackers, she aimed for the center fighter, the one at middle altitude. Her reasoning was instantaneous and intuitive. The high fighter would have to dive through the blast zone to attack, and the low fighter would have to climb through it. Create chaos in the middle, and the flanks become unstable. She fired a sustained burst, 4 full seconds, nearly 20% of her remaining ammunition. The center BF-109 disintegrated under the onslaught, literally came apart in midair as her rounds found something critical, probably the ammunition storage. The explosion was so violent that the high fighter had to brake hard right to avoid the debris, spoiling his attack run. The low fighter kept coming, though, and his cannon rounds tore into the Wellington's fuselage. Susan felt something hot slice past her face, shrapnel or a bullet fragment, she'd never know. Blood ran down her cheek, but she ignored it, tracking the fighter as it raced underneath. She fired straight down as it passed below, a desperation shot, but desperation can be guided by skill. Her bullets caught the fighter's tail assembly, and she saw the vertical stabilizer shear away. The BF-109 began an uncontrolled spin, the pilot struggling against aerodynamic forces he couldn't overcome. 5.5 down, 4.5 fighters left, and Susan could feel the Wellington dying around her. The aircraft was vibrating badly now, the damaged engine coughing smoke. They were losing altitude slowly but steadily, dropping from 12,000 feet toward 10,000. And her ammunition was almost gone, maybe 40 seconds of firing time left if she was lucky. The 4 remaining BF-109s had learned respect. They circled at a distance, like wolves around a wounded buffalo, looking for the final opening. Susan rotated her turret continuously, never letting them predict where she'd be aiming, never giving them a stable target picture. Sweat stung her eyes despite the cold at altitude. Her hands ached from gripping the guns so tightly. She tried to calculate the mathematics of what came next. For fighters, maybe 35 seconds of ammunition, approximately 200 miles per hour closure rate when they attacked, effective range of about 300 yards. The numbers didn't favor survival. "Susan," Michael's voice crackled over the intercom, "I'm going to do something mad. When I give the word, I want you to fire at everything. Doesn't matter if they're in range or not. Just fill the sky with bullets." "Sir, I'll run out of ammunition in. Trust me. Do you trust me?" She thought of her father, who'd taught her to trust the wisdom of hunters who'd survived when others hadn't. "Yes, sir. I trust you. Good girl. Stand by." The BF-109s were positioning for their final run, all 4 coming together in a coordinated attack from the stern quarter. This was it, the killing blow. They'd all hit simultaneously, overwhelming her ability to respond, and the Wellington would fall burning from the sky. Susan watched them begin their attack run, closing from 800 yards. 700. 600. "Now!" Michaels shouted, and the Wellington suddenly flipped inverted. A maneuver that should have been impossible for a heavy bomber, especially one damaged and barely airborne. But Michaels had somehow coaxed the dying aircraft into a barrel roll, and for one perfect moment, Susan's guns, which had been pointing at the sky, were pointing directly at the approaching fighters. She fired everything, both guns wide open, a sustained burst that emptied nearly all her remaining ammunition in one apocalyptic fusillade. The sky became a solid wall of tracer fire, and the approaching fighters flew directly into it. 2 BF-109s never had a chance to react. They disintegrated under the concentration of fire, torn apart by the sheer weight of bullets. A third took catastrophic damage to its engine and wing, immediately losing control and spiraling away. The fourth managed to break off, but not before taking hits that left it smoking and barely maneuverable. The Wellington completed its roll and struggled back to level flight, engines screaming with the strain. Susan sat in her turret, breathing hard, hands trembling now that the adrenaline was beginning to fade. Her guns were silent. She'd fired her last rounds in that final desperate burst. "Skipper," she called over the intercom. "I'm Winchester. Ammunition is gone." There was a pause, then Michaels laughed. Actually laughed, a sound of pure relieved hysteria. "Doesn't matter. Look around, Susan. Look around." She did, scanning the sky through her turret's perspex dome. Empty. Clear blue Mediterranean sky. Not a single enemy fighter in sight. She'd done it. Against every tactical doctrine, every probability calculation, every reasonable expectation, she'd survived. More than survived. She'd won. The next 35 minutes were the longest of Susan Wanjira's life. The Wellington was a wreck, barely holding together, losing altitude at an inexorable rate that no amount of pilot skill could stop. They dropped from 10,000 feet to 8,000, then to 6,000. The damaged engine finally gave up entirely about 20 minutes from the coast, leaving them on single-engine power. Susan climbed out of her turret. She had to, because there was damage to the hydraulic lines that needed emergency repair if they wanted the landing gear to work. She crawled through the fuselage, past holes she could see daylight through, past equipment torn and shattered by cannon fire. The aircraft smelled of hydraulic fluid, burnt metal, and fear. She found the damaged lines and, using techniques she'd learned from maintenance crews who never thought a woman would need such knowledge, managed to jury-rig a partial repair. It wouldn't hold for long, but it might hold long enough. As she worked, wedged into an impossibly cramped space with fluid dripping on her hands, she had time to think about what had just happened. 10 fighters. 2 minutes and 14 seconds. She'd later time it precisely from the aircraft's gun camera footage. It seemed impossible, something from a propaganda film rather than reality. But it was real. The evidence was all around her, the spent shell casings rolling around the aircraft floor, the smell of cordite that wouldn't leave her uniform for days, the blood on her face from the shrapnel wound. And most real of all were the Bf-109s that wouldn't be returning to their bases, the German pilots who'd started this day expecting routine combat and ended it in the cold Mediterranean waters. She felt no particular triumph about that. Her mother had taught her that killing, even necessary killing, even justified killing, was still a loss, for the killed, for the killer, for the world. But sometimes loss was the only path to survival, and Susan had chosen to survive. The Malta coast finally appeared on the horizon, a thin line of brown and green against the endless blue. The Wellington was down to 2,000 feet now, barely maintaining airspeed, both remaining crew members fighting to keep it aloft. They'd lost the navigator to flak during the initial raid, and the bombardier had been wounded. Susan had treated his injuries as best she could, but he'd need proper medical attention soon. "Susan, get back to your position," Michaels ordered. "The landing's going to be rough, and the tail wheel's probably not going to deploy properly. I need you there to assess damage and call out our altitude." She made her way back through the shattered aircraft, climbing into the rear turret one last time. From here she could see their whole tail section, and it was worse than she'd thought. The rudder was barely attached, the entire rear fuselage was riddled with holes, and portions of the skin were just gone, torn away by cannon fire. They came in fast and shallow because the pilot had no other choice. The Wellington hit the runway hard, bounced once, twice, then settled with a screaming metallic groan as the damaged tail wheel collapsed, and they skidded the last 500 yards on the rear fuselage. Sparks flew, metal tore, but somehow, impossibly, they held together. When they finally stopped, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the crew intercom came alive with laughter, tears, shouting, the sounds of people who'd accepted death and been granted a reprieve. Susan opened her turret and climbed out carefully. Fire crews were already rushing toward them, but she paused for a moment, standing on the wing of the aircraft that had carried her through hell. She looked up at the clear sky, remembering those minutes of combat, and felt something shift inside her, an understanding that she'd crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She was no longer the young woman who'd volunteered for service out of patriotism and adventure. She was something else now, a survivor, a defender, a weapon. Susan Wanjira's engagement that day was officially recorded as the most successful single defensive action by a bomber gunner in the entire Mediterranean campaign. 10 confirmed Bf-109 kills in 2 minutes and 14 seconds, a record that still stands in aviation history. But the military didn't quite know what to do with the story of a Kenyan woman achieving what few male gunners had accomplished. She was quietly awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, but the citation was deliberately vague about the circumstances, and for decades the story remained classified. It was only in the 1980s, when documents were declassified and Susan, by then retired and living in Nairobi, agreed to interviews, that the full details emerged. Military historians who've analyzed the gun camera footage and after-action reports still debate how she achieved what she did. The consensus is that it was a combination of factors: exceptional natural talent, perfect understanding of three-dimensional spatial relationships, coolness under extreme pressure, and the kind of instinctive tactical awareness that can't be taught. Some have called it luck, but as Susan herself said in a 1987 interview, luck is what people call skill they don't understand. She flew 17 more missions before the war ended, surviving them all, though she never again faced odds as desperate as that May afternoon in 1943. After the war, she returned to Kenya and became an advocate for women's education and veterans' rights, living to see Kenya's independence and working tirelessly to ensure that the contributions of colonial subjects to the war effort were properly recognized. Susan Wanjiru passed away in 2003 at the age of 82, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren who'd grown up hearing the story of the day their grandmother fought alone against the sky and won. Her ashes were scattered over the Aberdare Highlands where she'd learned to hunt as a child, the place that had taught her the skills that would one day save not just her own life, but the lives of her entire crew. The story endures as a reminder that courage has no gender, that heroism comes from unexpected places, and that sometimes, when the mathematics of survival say you should die, the human spirit rewrites the equation.